Good morning, afternoon, or evening to everyone joining us today. My name is Jessica Taylor, and I'm here at the Canadian Centre for Evidence-Based Conservation in Ottawa, Canada. We are located on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. On behalf of the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence, I'd like to welcome you all to our May session of the Environmental Evidence Summit webinar series. This session, Qualitative Evidence Synthesis, using qualitative evidence to inform decision-making, will be chaired by Dr. Ruth Garside and Dr. Biljana Macura. During the session, please submit your questions in the question box. So to get things started, I will hand it over to you, Biljana.
Thank you, Jess. Hello, everyone. As Jess explained, today we will be talking about qualitative evidence synthesis and using qualitative evidence to inform decisions in environmental policy and practice. Today's session is going to be composed of 4 different talks, and each they will last about 10 minutes, and we will have 5 minutes for question after each session. After all 4 talks are done, we will have a panel discussions followed by your questions that Jess already said that you can post your questions in the question box. First, we will start with an introduction to qualitative evidence synthesis by Professor Ruth Garside from University of Exeter. Then we will talk about environmental policy and practice relevant questions with qualitative evidence synthesis that I will be talking about. Then we will switch to Dr. Noreen Orr, and that will give an example of a qualitative evidence synthesis, after which Dr. Rebecca Rees will be talking about mixed method synthesis. In the panel discussion, we will be also joined by Dr. Becca Lovell. Okay, so before we start, I would like to ask you to answer 2 questions. In order to answer these 2 questions that you see on your screen, you can follow the link that is here on the screen, but you can also, I think, find that link now in the chat box. And either follow the link or just go to menti.com and use the code 33952877 to leave us answers to these 2 questions. I'll give a couple of minutes before we see the results. I think you can see live results as they're coming in. And we can see that today we have quite experienced audience among us here. And a lot of you are curious about these new methods. Okay, I think I will stop here and I will hand over to Ruth to introduce what qualitative evidence synthesis is and give a little bit of introduction about guidelines for qualitative evidence synthesis.
Thank you, Biljana. So hopefully you can now see my screen. I'm just going to give a bit of an overview to qualitative evidence synthesis in the context of the global situation. We live in unprecedented times where there is huge changes happening for our world, population increase, increasing urbanization, a warming planet with increased atmospheric CO2, global temperatures rising, and changes in the environment in terms of forest cover, reduction in ice and permafrost, coral bleaching events, and extreme weather. And all of these issues are linked to the health of the people of the planet, of environmental health, and the health of the animals. This kind of concern has been recognized through actions like the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which is interested in both improving human health and well-being, but also conserving the natural environment and thinking about how development can be undertaken through partnership for common goals. But these big problems and their solutions are messy and multiple. They interact with each other, they cross national boundaries, they cross sectorial boundaries, and they have impacts across all levels from local to global. So policy and practitioners need to know what works, but they also have other questions which are useful to policy and practitioners, which aren't necessarily encompassed by this what works question. And Biljana is going to talk a little bit more about questions for qualitative evidence synthesis. But just briefly, there are a number of different sorts of questions that the views, experiences, and perceptions of people can be really useful in order to understand, for example, at the beginning of the policy cycle, to understand the nature of scope of a problem or issue and to diagnose it. When policy is being developed, then ways of assessing policy and practice options can also use the views of people about how different policy programs, options, and outcomes are regarded, and think about acceptable and feasibility of different options. They might also offer insights into how an intervention might work, particularly for complex interventions or those that rely on human behavior change and interactions between different parts of the system. Once policy or practice has been chosen, there are then issues of implementation, how to make those policies actually come to practice, and understanding people's preferences for different implementation strategies. Once a policy is in place, then understanding the impact of that doesn't just rely on the quantitative research about what works, but also might be interested in understanding factors that influence how it's being implemented, whether it's true to how it was designed, whether there are unexpected or adverse consequences. Sorry about the cat. And so qualitative research can be really important to address some of these issues, but we know that individual studies may not be as reliable as combined evidence from multiple studies. And study findings are more likely to be transferable to other contexts, either where they are found across studies in different contexts, or where these findings can be brought together to create more explanatory findings or theory which explain how or why something is happening. And these kinds of theoretical findings may be more transferable. So this is where qualitative evidence synthesis can be really valuable. It brings together the findings of existing qualitative research on a similar topic, and the synthesis involves a combination of two or more items into a new whole. So these ideas can be combined to form a system or a theory and to create new knowledge which goes beyond the sum of its parts. And like other systematic reviews, it takes a systematic approach to identifying the evidence, critically appraising the studies that it finds, and synthesizing the findings of those studies. Why do we want to do this? Initially, I think decisions around qualitative evidence synthesis were driven partly by strategic considerations. So the recognition that for policy and practice, systematic reviews were becoming more relied upon, and that qualitative research was in danger of becoming more marginalized. It's a less wasteful approach, which means that the findings of research can be reused and used to create these syntheses, which potentially can produce more powerful explanations or higher order conceptualization, which many people believe will yield truths that are better, more socially relevant, or more complete, and so can enhance the transferability of the findings. There are a number of similarities between systematic reviews of quantitative and qualitative research evidence. In both cases, they're trying to get a sense of the nature and scope of an evidence base, and they follow a sequence of steps to systematically review the relevant literature, including a clear description of the processes followed to identify, select, appraise, and synthesize the evidence which is found. But there also can be some differences. So this table shows some of the differences at stages which have developed over time, which try to account for the different nature of the type of evidence you find in qualitative research compared to quantitative, and try and make the best use of the resources available. So we might find that the question, for example, might be finalized over time in response to initial findings and might be more iterative. For the search strategy again may be refined through the project as you come to understand issues that are more important, which may not have been obvious from the protocol stage. And there are also increasing reviews which use a kind of purposive sampling in order to extract information from the most robust studies, for example, across a range of different settings, in order to have space to do a more in-depth analysis rather than a shallow analysis across too many studies. And that also might take into account issues like data saturation in a similar way to primary qualitative research does. The inclusion and exclusion step might take more time because it may not be evident from the abstract whether or not papers are relevant to your research question. So that may take a little bit more reading of full papers than you typically have in a quantitative review. And again, for outcomes, these might be refined through identifying important findings from the research body itself rather than being pre-specified. While quality appraisal is often judged using a quality appraisal tool, it may also be judged through the contribution to the synthesis. So papers which have more explanatory power, for example, and are used as theoretical frames for the other papers might be judged to be of higher quality than those which are more descriptive. And then finally, the pooling or synthesis of the results, rather than being an aggregative adding together or summation of the findings, may be done through translation or thematic analysis to transform and expand on the findings that are there. And as well as this, it's important to get the process right. So ensuring that you have a multidisciplinary team that understand qualitative methods as well as the topic, that you have engagement with decision makers, the protocol is developed in consideration with this wider group. And similarly to other sorts of systematic reviews, double screening and double quality appraisal is useful to ensure quality. And it might be useful to do some double coding of the findings as well. All in all, discussion is really important across these sorts of projects, across the multidisciplinary team. There's a range of terminologies which have emerged about qualitative evidence synthesis. It can be a bit overwhelming. Some of these only have a very small number of reviews that have been conducted using them, and some are specific and some are generic. So these two terms, metasynthesis and qualitative evidence synthesis, are often used as overarching terms to describe any specific approach to evidence synthesis. We tend to use qualitative evidence synthesis. And as I said, these reviews tend to sit on a spectrum, so there are some more aggregative approaches which are more engaged in summing up or aggregating existing themes, and this can be useful where we already have some clearly defined concepts that we're trying to understand. We might use more deductive approaches. And at the other end of the scale, there are more interpretative approaches to synthesis, which think about arranging and interpreting existing findings to give a meaningful picture of what the research is telling us as a whole. And these sorts of reviews have more of a focus around developing explanatory concepts and theories to explain the evidence base and interpret what's going on. And these tend to take a more inductive analytic approach. And this diagram shows how different approaches sit along a spectrum from the more additive on the right-hand side, things like content analysis and thematic summaries, up to the more interpretative processes on the left, like meta-ethnography. And the thing along the bottom is about theory, so those more aggregative, deductive approaches tend to test theory, whereas the more interpretative, inductive approaches tend to generate theory.
Ruth, you have a little time left. No?
Okay. So thinking about how we make sense of evidence, we can often think of levels of interpretation, say first, second, and third order constructs, where the first order are the everyday ways of making sense of our world, which are seen in participant quotes and descriptive themes. Second order constructs are social science researchers' interpretations of this common sense world. And then the systematic reviewer or synthesis job is to create third order constructs, which are the interpretations of these existing interpretations, getting further away from the data and more abstracted into the theory. The method you choose will depend on a number of aspects, thinking about the experience of the team, the resources available, the purpose of the review, which is often linked to the audience, and the type of evidence that's available to you. So if you want to find out more, do watch this space. We have a working group for the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence, jointly with the Campbell Collaboration. We're in the process of trying to develop some guidelines around qualitative evidence synthesis in this field. The members are listed here. The ones greyed out are taking a step back and are going to offer some peer review for us. The ones in black have written things, and we're lucky enough to have many of these people speaking today. This is the structure for the book or the guidance. It's not going to be a book, it's much shorter than that. And in terms of our progress, we've got first drafts of all the chapters now, and we're internally reviewing those before a full edit of the guidance. And then we'll be taking it for external review with some critical friends, and thinking about developing some templates. So there will be more information about this in CE soon. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, please drop them in the chats.
Hi, Ruth, thanks so much for this great talk. We do have one question, and that is, are there standard criteria for critical appraisal on qualitative reviews? I see also one hand up, but I think at the moment it's better if you type in your question in the question box. And we have about 1 more minute left for a little discussion.
Yeah, so in terms of frameworks for quality appraisal, yes, those exist. They've mostly been developed thinking about the health field, and one of the most commonly used, CASP, was specifically developed to help practitioners think about the quality of qualitative research in terms of their practice. There are actually more than 100 checklists for qualitative evidence research. It's quite a contested field. And there is work being done at the moment through the Cochrane Qualitative Group and the CertQual Group, who are trying to synthesize those tools that exist to bring together key aspects of a tool to produce a more sort of consolidated approach. But yes, those are available.
Thank you, Ruth. I think that's all for now. Maybe we could continue with the next presentations. Okay.
So I should introduce you, Biljana. Passing you over to Biljana Macura, who is an experienced member of the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence and is starting to grapple with some of the tricky issues of how to apply existing qualitative evidence synthesis methods to the environmental field. Thank you, Biljana.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Okay, so today I will be talking about different environmental policy and practice questions that can be addressed with qualitative evidence synthesis, but I also intend to explain why qualitative evidence synthesis are very important and needed in the field of environmental policy and practice. I think Ruth already very well explained the context in which we are operating, being researching about environment, about environmental policy and practice. We are dealing often with wicked problems, such as problems of climate change, biodiversity loss, ecosystem management, and these problems are obviously of very high complexity. We often have very imperfect knowledge about them, and they're embedded in both social and ecological systems and technical systems, if I can say. We have very irreparable damages due to these environmental problems that often cross scales and sectors. And when we talk about research about these problems, this research is interdisciplinary often in either theory, methods, or data. And interventions introduced to resolve these environmental problems are complex with multiple components, constantly interacting with environments where they are introduced. And therefore, in order to have a more complete understanding and of these issues, and to better inform environmental policy and practice, we often need a broad range of evidence, research evidence to do that. Currently, environmental systematic reviews are mostly focusing on the synthesis of quantitative evidence, looking into intervention effectiveness or the impact or exposure to unintended or to different human activities. They're a little bit less focused on policy effectiveness, or they're, I would say, also less focused on building new theories or frameworks. As Ruth said, that they're often aggregative in the way how they approach synthesis. If qualitative data is included, this data is often analyzed quantitatively, or it's superficially integrated into quantitative with the quantitative data when it comes to mixed methods reviews. Evidence is scattered across different contexts, socio-political, geographical, environmental contexts. And so what is missing is that in systematic reviews that tackle environmental policy and practices, actually wider range of review questions that need to be answered to inform policy and practice. So not only what works, but also why an intervention did not work, how the intervention works, for whom. We need to understand different voices, different ideas, different knowledges, and concerns of various types of stakeholders involved in environmental policy practice, biodiversity conservation, environmental management. But for that, we need obviously transparent, consistent, and rigorous systematic approaches to qualitative evidence synthesis. And as Ruth already explained, luckily methodological guidelines for qualitative evidence synthesis in this field are currently in development. So with environmental qualitative evidence synthesis, we can therefore have more nuanced views of intervention effectiveness, understand implementation context, build novel theories, frameworks, And finally, facilitate integration of conservation social science. That is really now one of the growing fields. So integration of that types of social science research into policy and practice. We will then get findings that are obviously more broadly applicable to new contexts across different problems, and explanations that are more complete. When it comes to the typology of review questions, you already heard from Ruth that some of the review questions, or most of the review questions that can be applied and to synthesize qualitative evidence synthesis can be applied across the policy and practice cycles, from problem definition to implementation and evaluations. So apart from answering questions regarding about effectiveness, which in qualitative evidence synthesis could sound like how does a local community perceives intervention effectiveness, so focusing on perceptions, qualitative evidence synthesis could answer questions about appropriateness, feasibility. So for example, in this case would be how a management strategy might best be implemented in a given context. Is that management strategy feasible? What are barriers and facilitators to implementation of that strategy? Then we can also ask questions about adoption and acceptability. For example, extent of the adoption of conservation policy and practice. Or we could be more curious about subjective experiences, perceptions, beliefs, attitudes of community towards conservation intervention, or towards a specific environmental impact. We can also try to understand better heterogeneity in the outcomes. For example, which values people attach to different outcomes, for whom intervention did not work, why and how. So when we are talking about systematic review questions, we are talking about systematic review components. These systematic review components, components of systematic review questions. They are not only there to clarify the scope of a systematic review, but also help to search for studies and include relevant evidence. And in quantitative systematic reviews, these question components are usually PICO or PECO kind of and type of questions. That they're looking at the population, intervention and exposure. They are comparing that to no intervention. Or alternative intervention outcome. They're looking at specific outcomes and specific study types. But when we are translating that into qualitative evidence synthesis, we have many different types of question components. And these are just some of the examples. So, for example, intervention becomes a part of a larger phenomenon. So we are usually looking at a phenomenon of interest, where participants, where there is a very much focus, where there is a focus on engagement or kind of interaction between intervention and the participants, and very much importance on the setting, on the perspective, etc. So to exemplify, I will show you two different types of questions. So for example, with the what is experience of older people with terrestrial protected areas in the context of high-income countries? The population would be here older people, phenomenon of interest, experience with terrestrial protected areas, and context in this case would be high-income countries. This is an example of PICO with small o, as we would say, question type. And it's invented question. When it comes to, for example, SPICE type of a question, we are, I have here an example that would say in what ways, if any, collaborative forest management project influence women in low and middle income countries. In this context, we have a setting that is rural communities, perspective from, in this case, would be perspective of women. Intervention or phenomenon of interest would be collaborative forest management. Compared if need to areas without these kinds of projects, and then a type of evaluation would be one's perception experience about these projects. Here I would like to show a couple of examples of different types of qualitative or mixed methods reviews, just to understand and show you what types of questions as well you can ask. So one, how do older people describe their sensory experiences of the natural world is a type of a thematic synthesis, and actually we have both of the authors, two of the four authors here with us today, so you can ask questions about this particular review. So it is about people's experiences. The second example that you see on the screen is about actually socioeconomic outcomes. In this case, it's a mixed method a review about payments for environmental services, and so socioeconomic outcomes were parted about extracted qualitative data about. Then we have an example of a review on human well-being, where an impact of protected areas, where people experiences and perceptions about terrestrial protected areas were evaluated, etc. So there are a couple of different types of reviews on the screen at the moment, but there are many other opportunities with qualitative evidence synthesis that can be used and explored in our field. And with this, I would like to thank you and just acknowledge that some of the part of my presentation is coming from a paper that actually was published in 2019, and it talks about systematic reviews of qualitative evidence synthesis for environmental policy and management.
Thank you very much for that, Biljana. That's really helpful to give an overview of some of the papers and sorts of questions that this kind of synthesis can address. I don't have any specific questions coming through for you, but if people do have questions, I'll be joining us for the panel discussion at the end. So Biljana, you may want to ask your questions then. So I think we'll move on to our next speaker, who is Dr. Noreen Orr from the University of Exeter in the UK. Noreen has a wealth of experience of qualitative research, both primary research and qualitative evidence synthesis, and in particular has done a number of projects thinking about, excuse me, older people and their connection to nature and connections to nature and mental health. So thank you, Noreen.
Thank you, Ruth. I've shared my screen. Yeah, has that worked?
Yes, it has. It's not on presentation view, but we can see the slides.
Hopefully it's going to go now, I hope. Is it? Right, I think that should be it.
That's it. Yep, all good. Your slides are showing, but we can't hear you, Noreen.
It looks like Noreen has gone offline. I'll see if I can. Yes, it looks like Noreen is still offline, so she may have lost connection. Ruth, would you like to move on to the next speaker? Rebecca, are you okay to go while Noreen reconnects?
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you, Rebecca.
No worries.
Hopefully we'll get Noreen back before the end of the session. So Dr. Rebecca Rees from the Epicenter and the University College London. Again, very grateful to have Rebecca here. She's been working in systematic reviews and particularly qualitative evidence synthesis and mixed method syntheses, which she's going to talk about today, for a number of years, so has a lot of experience to share with us. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about mixed method synthesis, as Ruth said. The Epicenter, where I work, has been around for 28 years, I saw this morning, and we were doing some of the first mixed methods systematic reviews, and it's fascinating to see how they've been developing. I've been working at the centre for almost 20 years myself, mainly in the area of public health. So if anybody wants to work on an environmental evidence mixed methods or qualitative evidence synthesis with me, please get in touch, because this area really fascinates me. And I'm going to talk today about how we've talked a bit about research questions, but there's a sort of additional set of questions that mixed methods can get us close to answering. And I'm going to talk about 3 particular reviews. And yeah, they're all worth a look. I've got a reference list at the end. And I think one thing to focus on is, are mixed methods reviews for you? So you might want to think, if you're pulling together a group of people that you're ready to work with, what kinds of skills might they need to address the different kinds of things that I'm going to talk about today. So yeah, sort of back to the basics. Mixed methods approaches, there's a long history of methodological work where people will go out and collect quantitative data, and they will collect qualitative data, and they will mix it. So I've just referenced one of the key papers in the literature base here. But more recently, there's been this focus on methodology for systematic reviews that also, as Pierre Pluy and Quan-Ma Hong say, combine the power of stories and the power of numbers. So we've got that picture there of balloons with numbers on them. They're telling slightly more than either one of those things would alone. And we've talked about questions before, so here's a sort of a couple of formulations for the questions that might be asked of mixed methods reviews. So it's not just about effectiveness, it's not just about processes and appropriateness, feasibility, perceptions that have been talked about prior to this. It's this bigger sort of overall picture about sort of conditionality or contingency. So maybe it's ideas around what are the moderating and mediating factors that come into play when interventions are put into place. I focused on interventions, but there could of course be mixed methods reviews that maybe survey people's ideas about a phenomenon using a quantitative tool, and then also ask qualitative questions. So, but I focused on interventions in this session. And not only is it great, are they useful to ask and answer these compound questions, but the feared outcome of having an empty effectiveness systematic review is not to be overlooked. So yes, if you can find some more ideas from the more qualitative literature to develop hypotheses in a sort of systematic way, that's much better than having an empty review. So I've come covering 2 reviews in a little bit more detail. This is the first one by Birte Snilsveit. And here I put this slide just to talk about the topic, which was relatively new to me when I started looking into it. This idea of payment for environmental services may be much more familiar to a lot of you. And this is a picture of a part of the briefing. So it's presenting the findings there in a headline, and striking a bit of a cautious note because the quantitative evidence isn't so strong. But this is about some environmental outcomes there, preventing deforestation and further degradation of forestry for climate change mitigation purposes. So in a minute, we'll look at what the qualitative synthesis adds and produces this final mix. But first of all, the methods for this review. So you can see from here, there are some ideas around searching that you could look into, and the different kinds of questions that might be asked in this mixed method approach. So there at the top, question 1, a question very much about impact of the payment environmental services intervention. But then questions 2 and 3 are more about design, implementation, and context. So some ideas about moderation, how to design and implementation features moderate effectiveness, and then also about the sort of context and how that might influence things. And on the right there, you can see the different kinds of study designs that were sought to answer these 2 questions, 2 groups of questions. Now, one of the interesting things about this review is that they used a study design filter. So they sort of started with the effectiveness question and searched for those kinds of studies to address question 1. And then they did a follow-up search for the more qualitative studies using things like citation tracking. And if you think about your study team, you could almost already start to think about the kinds of people that might work on screening that first set and the kinds of people that might work on screening the second set. So here's a little bit more about the findings, and it starts to point to what the qualitative studies add. So they're cautious about the effectiveness findings, so we're using words like may, but there are the conditionalities, the top middle on the right. Indications from the qualitative data are that it will depend. So that's the kind of output that you might start to get in this kind of mixed method systematic review. It also talks there about specific hypotheses that can be developed from this combination of quant and qual findings. So strong governance structures might be something to investigate further. Now the second review, am I onto that one? Yeah, it's similarly about environmental management, with deforestation as one of its outcomes. And here is a sort of the briefing again. The bottom right hand talks a little about this intervention. So this idea that local authorities may have a better incentive for sustainable forest management with its links with the community interests. And on the top on the left, again, it's talking about modest effects. Not many studies found in this review, but there it's talking about how qualitative studies show democratically accountable. Oops. I'm just trying to see. No, I don't want to leave the webinar. Okay, I'll go on to the next slide. Hopefully you have a chance to read that slide. So it's about conditionality again. As long as the community is supportive of this scheme, then there's a chance that it might work. That's what the qualitative studies were pointing to. And the methods again are slightly different. So unlike the previous review, there was no study design filter. So there would have been the screening set would have been quite heterogeneous, quite different kinds of studies in there. And then they also followed up with a qualitative tailored search. And these are some ideas about how this group conceptualized their work. So they had specific questions, and there at the bottom are some questions about moderators. And I've I picked out the one about deforestation reduction impacts are positively moderated, they're at the bottom, by the level of local democratic accountability. And on the right, the review authors are thinking, yes, I can use quantitative measures to look at covariation between these 2 measures, but I can also use qualitative data, if I can find it, to look at how people talk about these things and how they affect the functioning and effectiveness of the programs. So a different way of laying out research questions, pointing out this moderating influence of local democratic accountability, and ideas about what can be done with different kinds of data. And the last thing I wanted to talk about in terms of methods was different kinds of outputs. So if you're used to a quantitative review or a qualitative review, you may not be so used to seeing this kind of output, which is a narrative example. And here you can see it's quite nuanced. There's a lot of interpretation going on. So the authors of the review are arguing, for example, Barral and Heinen studied DFM practices and they found a positive result. But it's quite carefully nuanced with cautious language. Again, it's hypotheses that are being derived. So that kind of skill in a research team, again, might need to be sought, people that are happy writing quite theoretically. And another output, quite different, let me just see if my 10 minutes is up, is what I've called here an annotated logic model from another review, third review, which I think Biljana showed earlier, about certification schemes. So for example, the labels that get stuck on bananas. And so here you can see there's a sort of theory of change represented by these different kinds of dots or lines. And there's a blue dotted line that shows that, what have they said, that it has small positive effects. All the other lines are suggesting no effect or inconclusive effects. But the important thing that's added by the qualitative literature here is the boxes on the left, which are the barriers and facilitators to implementation. And I can't go into too much detail here, but you can follow it up. They're in the middle. One of the facilitators they have from the qualitative literature about market interventions is that prepayment has to be enforced and sufficient. And they know that that isn't the case quite often from qualitative literature. So I've talked about the types of mixed method review that are in bold here, where qualitative and quantitative data are considered to be completely different entities. There are different approaches. Biljana, again, she showed a picture of a realist synthesis, which takes a different approach, more integrated or contingent, and temporality. So these reviews I've talked about, they did all of the reviewing in one lump. You might know of a quantitative review, and sequentially you could pick up and build on it with a qualitative review. This book's great for unpacking these kinds of distinctions. And then, yeah, just finishing on, is this for you? And really, one thing I really want to emphasize is do a mapping preliminary to all of this before setting off on a mixed methods projects. They're huge investments of time. And you want to know a little bit about what's out there before you try and make sense and choose what kind of mixed methods design you might do. Okay, that's me.
That's great. Thank you very much, Rebecca. And I've got a question which has come up, which speaks a little bit to your penultimate slide, I think. This is from Daniel Espina, who asks, to what extent is qualitative evidence synthesis exclusively a qualitative matter? And conversely, quantitative evidence only subject to aggregative synthesis or meta-analysis?
Yeah, so I have never done one of these kinds of reviews, but these reviews that, look at my slides again, these reviews that, oh,
next one,
that are more integrated, sometimes they can take approaches where they actually transform data. So qualitative data can be quantified into a yes or a no, or a more or a less, or a sort of a ranking scale. And likewise, quantitative data can be written up in a narrative form as well. So yeah, once you start looking into these clear distinctions between qualitative and quantitative that we might think are there, start dissolving. And Sandalowski, one of the people that's referenced on this slide about multiple mixed methods design, has written about that a lot. It's really interesting. I think at one point she even says, and what about pictures? What are they? Quantitative, qualitative, or something else? So there's a lot of diversity, a lot to make sense of.
Thanks, Rebecca. I think that's a really interesting question. It might be something that we pick up in the panel discussion later. I mean, obviously, many quantitative reviews don't have a meta-analysis at all, and they do a narrative synthesis, which is a telling the story of the numbers exercise. So yeah, I think there's a lot going on there that's interesting to think about. So I think we have got Noreen back. He's hoping that her connection lasts long enough to present her very interesting talk. Are you okay, Noreen? Oh, you're muted, can't hear you. Oh, I think we might have lost her. Oh no, there's some slides. Are you still there, Noreen?
I am.
Brilliant. We can hear you. Right, I'll turn off my camera and hope
I just
that...
wonder if it's better if I don't put my camera on,
Oh.
because that might just push it all over the limit.
Absolutely, yeah, no problem at all. I'll turn mine off too. So Noreen Orr is going to talk about qualitative evidence synthesis about therapeutic nature for people with mental health conditions. Thanks, Noreen.
Oh, thanks, Ruth. All right, I hope this is going to work. If I see anything odd on my screen, I'm going to take it that it's not working. So hello again, everyone. And I'm not quite sure what you caught from the very start the last time, but my talk today was to focus on an example of a qualitative evidence synthesis that I worked on between 2019 and 2020, in fact, with Ruth. And I'm hoping that I can illustrate a couple of things from it in the short time that we have, and that is that how a qualitative evidence synthesis can help us understand participants' experiences of therapeutic nature interventions, and also the complexity of nature-based interventions and their impact on people or different groups of people. So really, I just want to have a little bit of context, hopefully that's sufficient for you to understand what we were doing. I'd say a little bit about quantitative, qualitative, and then just draw out some highlights. And I will focus specifically on therapeutic gardening, which was a group of the nature-based interventions. Okay, so this qualitative evidence synthesis, it was part of a larger project that was commissioned by the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, what we call DEFRA, and it's a UK government department which has amongst its responsibilities, as it describes on the website, safeguarding our natural environment. And as you can see, there's a 25-year environment plan, and one of its key aims is to identify how we can best use the natural environment as a resource for preventative and therapeutic health programs. So that's kind of the backdrop for the project. Its aim was to understand what works for whom, in what circumstances, and how to support provision of nature-based therapeutic interventions for people with an identifiable mental illness. And there were several strands of work to the project, and a mixed method review was one of those. And just to quickly show you the review question, which was what are the impacts of therapeutic nature for people with diagnosed mental health conditions? And then the qualitative evidence synthesis had the how question, how are these impacts thought to have been achieved, and what participant and intervention factors might affect the impact. As you saw that Biljana talked through the PICO, so just thought it was worth sharing with you just what was the inclusion exclusion criteria. As you can see, the population was adults and children, mental health issues, the intervention was taking place using nature, and we had our comparators, our outcomes, which were to do with quality of life, well-being, all related to mental health. And for the qualitative evidence synthesis, we were interested in studies that looked at participant experiences of participating in nature-based interventions, and studies that used recognised methods of qualitative data collection and data analysis. Now, in terms of the quantitative review, and just having heard what Margaret was saying, this was a kind of a sequential, not sequential, we actually were happening at the same time, simultaneously, but the quantitative review There were 37 studies, but we find little robust evidence of effectiveness. There were few reliable RCTs. There were only 4 studies with RCTs, and 7 other studies used some kind of control or comparison group. So much of the quantitative evidence came from uncontrolled before and after studies. And with the lack of a control group, it's actually difficult to attribute change to the intervention. However, at the quantitative review, we felt there was some evidence from the trials that nature-based activities may positively impact on some of these depression and anxiety. So with that kind of context, I can tell you a little then about the qualitative evidence synthesis, which had 30 qualitative studies, 10 of which were mixed methods. 5 focused in on children or adolescents, but mostly we're looking at people, adults with mental health conditions, and some of these could be classed as quite severe or serious and included psychotic disorders, depression, mood disorders and schizophrenia. And the approach we used to synthesize the qualitative data was a framework synthesis approach. And here is the conceptual framework, which was developed by my colleagues, Ruth and Becca and another colleague, Karen, when they worked on a previous systematic review. And this pathway, it looks quite complex. I'm sorry, but I can't sort of dwell on it too long, but it conceptualizes a range of pathways through which health and well-being impacts may come through environmental activities. So in a way, this kind of framework, it can be described as a scaffold, or it's a way to organise and present qualitative review data. And it did give us flexibility because as new things are identified in the data, and if it doesn't fit into the existing framework, it can also be incorporated. And we did identify some new themes. So just to say a little bit on the themes, the activity moderators and the environmental moderators relate to the types of activity and the environment in which the activities are undertaken. The third theme, the mechanism moderators, reflect the reactions of individuals during implementation in a given context. And the fourth theme refers to personal mediators, so that could be expectations and physical ability, which affects outcomes. And then the fifth is the potential mechanisms of change, which thinks about how an intervention might work through different pathways or mechanisms to bring about change. Now, these themes are interlinked and they are an attempt to capture the complexity within an intervention. So just to give you very briefly some of the highlights, these are some of the activities that we find in the reviews. And I'm just going to focus and give you a little insight into the therapeutic gardening and horticultural programme. That was the most frequently evaluated intervention, and indeed 12 studies focused on therapeutic gardening for people with mental ill health. And 4 were specifically looking at those with symptoms of stress and aim to help return to work. 3 of the studies talked about how people became involved. And it could be recommended referral from GPs or community health practitioners, and of course there was self-referral. We also identified in the literature how the participants reacted to other participants in the programme and how that could impact how the activities were experienced. So one of the authors described how getting to know and getting on with other participants could be perceived as a challenge by some of the participants. And one participant described how it was strange to walk around with 7 other participants for the next 10 weeks, 3 times per week. So authors noted that while some participants needed time to cope with the presence of others, most found ways of managing. And in fact, for some, being with others and with a mutual experience of illness made a group of equals. And this is something that comes through from this participant who says, you know, he had reservations about meeting people, but since everybody's in the same situation. So belonging to a group facing similar difficulties was sometimes described as an important part of the programme. So environmental moderators, which I said was related to the environment, 5 of the studies, the gardening and horticultural programs, took place in spaces that were specifically designed for the nature-based therapy. And for example, one of the gardens in Arcadia Rehabilitation Garden was designed according to theories of restorative, nature's restorative effects. And it was specifically for people with exhaustion disorders. And it had separate garden rooms, informal nature garden and gardens for horticultural work. Now, one of the sort of aspects that was important was quietness. It was an important feature of the therapeutic gardens, and participants would describe the peace, the calm, the quiet they experienced. The gardens could seem like a world apart and allowed participants to wind down. And you can see this in this quotation that I've chosen, how the participant says, you can find calmness, you can feel your body reflect. So moving on to the third theme, and I just pull out one sort of aspect here, the relationship with nature, which was like one of our new sub-themes. And here it was about how participants in therapeutic gardening could speak about their personal relationship with nature, and how they would often talk about that in a very kind of sort of symbolic way, or they would weave it into their own narratives of recovery. And they were interested in sort of the rhythms and the cycles of nature and how it actually helped them understand themselves better. And they often talked about growth, the growth of plants, and make it into sort of nearly a narrative of their own personal progress. And I think this is captured quite well in this quotation, where the participant talks about my own growth. We grew together, so to say. So there's, and he also says it's about fun. Now, our conceptual model had quite a number of sort of personal mediators. I've chosen to focus on physical ability, because people's preferences and ability influenced the physicality of the activities in which they became involved. Some people embraced the whole idea of the physicality of the garden work, the rough, repetitive garden work. And then here's a participant, just to give you the other side, who says, well, I'm really tired, and I just didn't go for those activities that required too much physical strength. So you can see how the relevance of these mediators could be different for different people and might impact different groups of people. And I come to the final sort of mechanism of the final theme that I've just chosen, and it picks up on sort of this whole sort of symbolic identification with nature, where people were using the metaphors or the symbols to identify. And even in the activities they used, like they were doing, like pruning and planting and growing and digging, they could they talked about it in a symbolic way, really in effect sort of like a metaphor. And here's just I think a lovely example of someone who says he loves cutting the hedge at the back. It's quite therapeutic. It's like me getting rid of my problems. So this is just to give you a little flavour of some of the findings. And I guess just to get to some concluding thoughts, we concluded that the qualitative evidence synthesis, it showed broad and wide-ranging perceived impacts on well-being, mood and functioning. There were differences in experience depending on the type of the intervention. And as I've chosen to focus on the gardening and horticultural therapy, what came through there was the importance of calm restoration, with participants symbolically identifying with nature in order to understand their own recovery journeys. And I think the themes show how the setting, the intervention, the person, the group, they all interact in incredibly complex ways for participants. And I hope it's very short, but I hope it gives some kind of insight into the complexity of trying to design these kind of nature-based interventions to support mental health. And also you can see how it's probably quite incredibly challenging to evaluate these kind of interventions. And I guess trying to, design an RCT would be incredibly expensive and difficult to do. So I hope that you can see what the qualitative evidence synthesis can bring to these kind of questions on people's experiences of interventions, and gives us, as I say, an insight into the complexity. I do hope that's all worked just fine. And I just want to say as well, on this project, I worked with my colleagues Ruth and Becca Lovell, and here is the link to the Therapeutic Nature project. So thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Noreen. That all seemed to work perfectly. I've got a couple of questions in the chat. Thank you for those. Please do continue to put questions in the chat, either for any of the speakers or any general questions or comments you might have about qualitative evidence synthesis for the panel discussion afterwards. So there are two questions, Noreen, and they're both actually about the conceptual model or framework. I wonder if the first one might be better going to Becca Lovell, if Becca's around. Yeah, that's the one. So one of the questions was, how was this conceptual model developed? And this actually came from a previous project which both Becca and I were involved in. So it might be that, Becca, you're in a better position to describe that, how this was developed.
I can have a go. It was a long, tortuous process. I mean, it literally was a long, tortuous process, because we did this through Cochrane, and it was, am I right, Ruth, in saying this was the first mixed method review in Cochrane?
I think it was the first mixed methods review in the Cochrane Library, yeah.
So the context of that was that we were in a sort of slightly tricky place anyway, that we were, using a method which wasn't commonly used through, obviously commonly used for Cochrane, and trying to integrate different bodies of knowledge to produce a summary infographic of what we thought was going on. And the reasons it was a bit problematic was that we were treading a very fine balance between sort of illustrating what we thought was going on and saying this is what the evidence says is going on. But the process of building it was through sort of iterative stages of bringing the different bodies of evidence together and recognizing the differences in those between the quantitative and the qualitative evidence, and doing processes of comparing, contrasting and tabulating and cross comparison between our different studies to try and pick out some of the key themes of what's happening in the activities, which is the lady with the spade and all the little thin lines with the different mechanisms of action, so being physically active and social contact and so on. And it was it's always difficult when we're writing out the methods for these to try and articulate exactly what happened and when and by whom, but it's a process of this constant comparison, of sort of pulling out the threads and then looking for them in the other studies, and then trying to sort of evaluate how relevant they are across the evidence body that we've included in the review. And actually the tricky bit of it was to try and articulate it in a sort of visual model, and I'm no expert in this, and actually this was an early stage of the model. It iterated another couple of times, but to try and address those initial concerns that we had from our editors at Cochrane about how we temper what the model is saying to the reader. It's not saying that these are definite proven pathways across all the studies, but often these are indicative factors which were coming out through the study. So it was a long process, but really interesting, and I think hugely valuable.
Thank you, Becca. Yeah, so this model tried to bring together the qualitative evidence synthesis and the potential outcomes. So in a sense, this is a theory. This is how we think impact comes about from people being involved in conservation or environmental enhancement activities, the factors that might moderate them, and the outcomes that we think might come about. So I suppose the short answer is that this was the sort of final conceptual model from a mixed method synthesis of a previous kind of linked review, but on a slightly different question to the one that Noreen was trying to answer. Yeah. And so the second part of that question from a different listener, Lucy, has asked for you, Noreen, just a clarification question, which is asking how that framework was used in the synthesis. And she says, is it that you tried to map onto that framework the findings of your review? Did it act as an a priori coding framework?
Yes, it did. It acted as like a framework, or as I use like the word, like a scaffold. But we were open to new themes or sub themes coming through. So not all. I think it was one about environmental change, and that didn't come through in the studies that we were reviewing for this project. So that was in our conceptual framework, but then there were other new themes or sub-themes that came through. So I think that sort of speaks to the whole framework synthesis approach, that it's quite flexible. So it's good, it's good when you're needing, it gives you a good start because you've got a framework. But it's open and it's flexible to new themes coming through.
Great, thank you, Noreen. So we've got about 15 minutes left, or actually 20 minutes left for debate. So Biljana, Noreen, Becca Lovell, and Rebecca, you're really welcome to join us if you're able to stay. So if anyone does have any further questions, generic questions or specific questions for the speakers, we'd be really happy to hear them. Please just type them into the box.
Ruth, actually, while we're waiting, can I ask one more question to Noreen regarding her review? It's very, very fascinating, Noreen. I just wanted to ask you, and this is perhaps maybe a question that is also relevant for all different kinds of evidence synthesis. I would like to know, there is a lot of potentially great policy implications coming out from your review. And I was wondering, was there any, or is there any plan for increasing the policy uptake of this review? How to go about that? I think this is a 100 years old question that we all are wondering. But do you have any thoughts on that actually?
Well, it's a good question, Biljana. And as I said at the beginning, that the whole project was part of a DEFRA project. And I'm sure Becca and Ruth can chip in here. I know we are hopeful that our work will have impact. And I know it's always like quite a long drawn out process when you're dealing with like government bodies. And I do think now Ruth or Becca will know a bit, because Becca's the one that has lots of contacts with DEFRA. So you probably can fill in a bit more, I would say.
Do you want me to jump in? Yeah, it's always a real tension when we go and talk to policy departments, policy and decision makers, and particularly people who are delivering services. And I think there is a real individual element to this, that certain people are more open to the types of evidence that are produced through qualitative syntheses. But we've had very good experiences, certainly with the people we work with in DEFRA and Public Health England and others here in England, actually recognise what qualitative syntheses tell us and how they can be used. And particularly around some of the work we're doing now around how to improve people's health through environmental interventions. They are very interested in how to do it well and how to address some of the concerns that people might have when you're trying to deliver some of these interventions. and the nuance in understanding of what's going on and responses to them. And I think they recognise that actually qualitative work is hugely valuable here. But this goes hand in hand with other forms of evidence. I haven't met many policymakers who would prioritise qualitative over other forms. Typically, it's a sort of horses for courses, and they recognise that different types of evidence have different roles. But that's not to say it's been all positive. I've, like many of us, have had to fend off it's just journalism, or it's, you know, how do you sort of generalize from qualitative work and so on. And it's, you know, it's changing, and I think it's becoming less common, but it's certainly happening still.
I think one of the other things is that, you know, if you go to policymakers with purely quantitative evidence, they tell stories to themselves about that information anyway. You know, the policymaking process tends to be a conversation. You know, it's often a committee room where people are talking to themselves about both what they think, but also the political context and also the research evidence in front of them. So if you don't provide the qualitative evidence, they tell their own stories, you know, and you don't necessarily get such a broad range of perspectives of different people's understandings of an issue or a problem. You just get those of the people in the room. So I've got a couple of questions coming up in the chat. One is, how can qualitative evidence synthesis be used for a broader perspective, like developing governance frameworks for environmental management projects or programs, or developing a representative workable methodology for evaluating projects or programs? I'm not sure I 100% understand this question. So how can qualitative evidence synthesis be used for a broader perspective, like developing governance frameworks for environmental management, or developing workable methodologies for evaluating projects or programs? I don't know if anyone's feeling brave enough to take that one on.
I'll jump in quickly. One of our partners is Natural England, and they do a lot of regulatory work, and an environment agency as well here in England. And they are becoming much more interested in the role of qualitative and the value of qualitative work in understanding how to do the work that they do. And that is part of governance frameworks, is understanding how the regulatory frameworks in which you're trying to deliver environmental improvements or environmental protection, for instance, will be received by the community's practice that you need to influence their behaviour of, or ways of working. And I certainly, Natural England have had conversations with us about how do they do what they do better and avoid some of the risks or you know, the sort of challenges which inevitably come as they try and deliver some of these governance frameworks or regulatory frameworks. So I think there is a role there for qualitative work, is trying to explore some of those possibly anticipatable unintended consequences of the ways in which people work, or could work, or these things could be delivered. And it's quite tricky, because, you know, you get to that question of generalizability and how many, you know, what sort of extent of work you need to do to inform the role of these or the rollout of these kind of approaches. But I think it's becoming increasingly recognised that it can be used in that way particularly.
Thanks, Becca. And I think in answer to the second part of that question, developing workable methodologies for evaluating projects or programs. I mean, again, I think that is another way in which qualitative evidence synthesis can be used, either to identify outcomes and impacts that matter to the different stakeholders, whether that's the population that's sort of on the receiving end of an intervention, or the people who are trying to deliver it, and can certainly help to shape recommendations for how a policy looks and how it's implemented, and what kinds of things are important to measure in terms of understanding impact.
Also, perhaps if I can add, if the intervention is appropriate, especially for specific groups of people, for specific, in specific context, etc. So therefore, it can contribute to a better design or better measurements of specific context. Outcomes, sorry, that is usually not possible with quantitative evidence synthesis.
Thanks, Biljana. And the next question I have says, I get the impression that qualitative evidence synthesis is used in cases when the outcomes are not clear or they're difficult or impossible to measure. Is that right?
Maybe can I jump, maybe can I start here? Maybe it's not about outcomes that are impossible or difficult to measure. It's just different kinds of outcomes that are talking about perceptions of people. And I've been quite a few times corrected actually that we are not talking about outcomes, but actually qualitative findings here when we're talking about qualitative evidence synthesis. So it's, I would say it's in this sense, it's just a different way of thinking about what outcome is. And this is, as I said, more about perceptions of people. But maybe someone else can add a little bit more to my half answer.
Yeah, I think quite often it's not the case that it's just never that straightforward. Has anybody seen a review where the answer is yes, it works? It's always, there's always a variation in who it might work for and what kinds of settings it might work for. And without those kinds of exploratory analyses, you don't understand what's really going on in the world. I mean, there may not be very many quantitative studies able to answer questions of effectiveness out there, in which case it's useful to have these more qualitative studies to start looking at hypotheses. But no, that they're addressing different kinds of research questions, completely different and complementary ones.
Yeah, I think maybe it was slightly coincidence that I think both you, Rebecca, and Noreen mentioned a mixed methods review where that happened to be the case, that there wasn't very much in the quantitative evidence, and so the qualitative had that particular role of fleshing out the understanding. But it's one, I think, of many ways that qualitative evidence synthesis can be used. And yeah, I mean, obviously qualitative evidence synthesis can be a standalone project. So you could do, like the example that Biljana shared from Noreen about understanding how our older people have this sensory connection to the natural world. That was purely a qualitative exploration of trying to understand the kind of multisensory experience of people with nature. Whereas other mixed methods reviews, there are lots of different ways that the qualitative and quantitative may relate to each other, whether that's qualitative first to help frame the quantitative, quantitative first, and the qualitative might help to explain heterogeneity or other issues, some kind of parallel approach where complementary but different issues are being considered. So there are many different ways, I think, that they might relate to each other. And there's a couple more. Oh, we're getting many more questions in now, so we might have to start speeding up. So there's one question where the circumstances, conditions, or moderators which you described in different studies, could they not simply be used as comparators in a quantitative review? Nobody's jumping on that question, so I might start. I think yes, it is possible if you've got a big enough evidence base where you're able to do subgroup analyses or a meta regression in a meta analysis, then you may be able to explore the impact of circumstances, conditions, or moderators. But that's often not the case, that there often isn't enough, or there aren't enough studies to allow you to do a meaningful subgroup analysis or meta-regression in a meta-analysis. Also, you may not know about them. You know, normally if you're going to do subgroup analyses, meta-regression, whatever, you write in your protocol that you think those moderators are likely to be ones that would inform any subgroup analyses. So you might not have known about these specific contexts which we think are operating as moderators in order to plan a meta-analysis. So I think it gives you a different sort of way of interrogating the evidence base, which is not necessarily numeric and doesn't rely on those kind of either pre-specified, anticipated moderators, or having enough studies in your meta-analysis to do that analysis. So it's kind of a complementary approach. The next one is, are there any software tools or online services that you would point to as particularly useful for qualitative evidence synthesis?
Well, NVivo can be used. That's used in primary qualitative research. So NVivo can be used to help sort of do the coding work in a qualitative review. For sure, yeah.
If I
Yeah.
can
So and I guess any software. Sorry, who was that? You, Biljana, talking?
I was just gonna add to that, but go on, Ruth, please.
I was just going to say any of the sort of qualitative, any of the software that supports qualitative analysis can also be used for qualitative synthesis. You can now just upload the PDFs and you can code directly onto the papers, which can be really useful. Yeah, go on, Biljana, were you going to say something else?
Sorry. I was also going to say that some of the review management softwares can also help in qualitative evidence synthesis. For example, Epi Reviewer has a coding option as well. Maybe someone else know about some other softwares, but
those are probably the only ones I've experienced of. I'm not sure what the questioner means by online services. So Sindra, you might qualify that with a follow-up question if we haven't answered your question. And then just a couple of minutes left. So the final question is, what about the role of qualitative evidence reviews for hypothesis development? Isn't that a key role of this? Such as development is
Sorry, Ruth, we're having a hard time hearing you. It's cutting out. We can see you talking, but it's not coming through.
Type of configurational qualitative evidence synthesis.
Ruth, maybe you can repeat what you said.
She's gone.
So qualitative evidence in without the video. No. Biljana, do you want to take over reading the questions?
Yes, I was, yes. Okay, so we have a question that is, what about the role of qualitative evidence reviews for hypothesis development? Isn't that a key role of this type of configurational qualitative evidence synthesis? Yeah, if someone wants to jump on that one. Rebecca, are you?
Yeah, I think exactly. The hypothesis testing is the main thing really that they do. So you'll see from the examples that were talked about in this session today, they're not testing theories to arrive at something about the precision of an impact. They're more saying this is how this impact could come about, and that could then be reformulated as a hypothesis that could be tested, maybe by some follow-up quantitative research. But it's also very valuable as a hypothesis in itself.
Yes, definitely, especially when they are preceding the quantitative bit, when they are introducing kind of and testing the initial hypothesis, then can be further exploring the initial hypothesis that can be further tested, let's say in quantitative bit. Does anyone wants to add to that?
No, it's good.
Okay, perfect. But I think we have reached the end actually of the session, so we might just stop here. And I would like to thank everyone. And apologies about the technical issues, but that's how it is. Jess, do you want to say something about the next webinars?
Yes, thank you, Biljana and Ruth, for chairing that session. Thanks to all of our presenters. That was very interesting. I would like to invite you all to join us for the next webinar in June. It'll be on June 8th, and it is Learning with Each Other, promoting cross-sectoral collaboration for evidence synthesis. And this will be chaired by Andrew Pullen and Jeremy Grimshaw. So registration is open now, and you can find it on our website. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jess.